Another politics is a term that I use that actually first came out of a study group and collective in New York City called the Another Politics is Possible Collective, that brought a delegation to the first U.S. Social Forum in 2007 of 100 people from about a dozen organizations. And they were drawing on some vocabulary from the Zapatista rebels in Chiapas, Mexico, who talk about the other campaign that they're trying to carry out and other ways of doing politics. And so I kind of borrowed this idea of another politics as a way to talk about this emerging and certainly not coherent or fully developed kind of politics that I see developing across a range of movements right now, particularly on the radical edges of various movements, from the Occupy movement to aspects of Idle No More, to migrant justice organizing, to the movement against the prison industrial complex, and so on. I see this kind of developing politics there that is really trying to transform all systems of oppression, exploitation, and domination, while also trying to put forward constructive alternatives to these kinds of ruling systems and institutions. And another politics is a way that it's almost like a placeholder that I try to use for this kind of developing politics that I think people in movements are trying to figure out right now and are putting into practice in many ways. And we can go more in depth into some aspects of it, but that's the kind of the basic outline of it.
Okay. Yeah, and I think just to describe it as an anti-authoritarian approach was kind of the key way you were anti-authoritarian current. Was that how you described it?
Certainly, that's another way that I talk about another politics is as developing out of a kind of political tendency or political current that I call the anti-authoritarian current. And when I say anti-authoritarian, I don't just mean anarchist. I mean actually a whole variety of different kinds of political strands and political lineages of struggle, including radical women of color feminism, prison industrial complex abolitionism, certain kinds of radical anti-colonial struggles that I see as not the same, but as having some very closely shared ideas about how to change things and some very closely shared ways of doing things in terms of organizing and bringing people together, bringing communities of people together in struggle.
Yeah. So this is a book. It's called Another Politics, and it's talking across today's transformative movements. Yeah. So can you describe a bit about the book?
For sure. So the book comes out of about 8 years of research and work that largely or most significantly involved me traveling around the US and Canadian contexts to several different cities and conducting interviews with long-time experienced radical organizers who in some way we could call anti-authoritarian organizers. And my hope in doing those interviews was to ask questions about what kinds of things are we learning? What kinds of challenges are we coming up against consistently in the work that we're doing? And also what kinds of unresolved questions are we facing? And the book was my attempt to bring together then about 4 dozen of these interviews and the insights, lessons, and questions that came out of them, and bring in, of course, my own experience as well as a longtime activist, and bring in some movement history, and try and put together something that could sort of collect this collective knowledge and make it usable for people in a whole bunch of different places who could then kind of participate in what I was trying to make, which was sort of like facilitating a cross-continental conversation with a bunch of really experienced people who unfortunately will probably never be in the same room together. But I was hoping that it could be something that could be shared and that could actually invite other activists and organizers in as we think about what we're doing, as we reflect on what we're trying to achieve and what we are actually achieving.
Yeah, and that was, I think, in a few places in the book it came out that the people that you interviewed ended up talking with each other in their cities about what was important and having some more in-depth movement reflection, I guess it is. And it was also in other parts of the book where it was really talking about the need to do this in-depth reflection and discussion on strategy, on what we're doing, what we think we're doing. There's a really good quote, which I don't have right now, but the thing where it's one of the parts is talking about or reflecting on what we think we're doing, as opposed to just what we are actually doing. And I don't know if you remember the rest of that quote. There's like 4 parts to it.
Yeah. I can't remember exactly the exact way that quote goes, but I remember that part of it is about how we often talk about what we want to do, but we don't talk so much about what we actually are doing or what we actually are achieving, and what difficulties are coming up in what we actually are achieving, and then taking time together to reflect on that, right? To say, like, what's actually happening here? What are we doing? What could we be doing differently and more effectively together? But yeah, that's right. Definitely, I heard from a few people after doing these interviews in different cities that they were really appreciative of the fact that I had helped to create some space for some of these bigger conversations about topics like strategy, or like what does organizing mean, or how do we go about building effective big movements, or how do we deal with thorny issues related to privilege and oppression as they come up within our groups. And people that I spoke to then sometimes sought out other people in their communities to continue to have these conversations, and that made me really happy. Like, my biggest hope really for this book was to in some way help to catalyze more of us coming together where we are with the people we're working with to talk about stuff and to try and do it better, and do it in a way that's actually like attentive to one another and part of a long-term relationship building process.
Yeah. And I guess now may be a good time to just describe the outline of the book. So there's basically 3 parts. The first part is what is the politics? So defining that, some history of it. And I think in the book you do a good job of historicizing things. So like talking about things as they're not, and I'm talking about this in terms of, say, if you're talking about consensus decision making, is that historicizing it means it's not just this static thing that's always been there and it's always the same, but it actually develops somewhere and it changes and it can change. So I think that speaks to, you're talking about dynamic experiments in what this politics is. So there's the politics section, and then there's the strategy section, and then there's the organizing section. So maybe just a brief description of those.
Yeah, for sure. So as you said, the politics section includes me trying to provide a little bit of history about sort of where do these politics come from, because I really see them as connected to long-term struggles going back as far as early fights against the colonization of the Americas, and also the original abolitionist movement, the movement against slavery on this continent, as well as early socialist politics. So I see like long-term connections there, and I see ways that many of the things that we take for granted now, like consensus decision making or collectives as a form of organization or certain kinds of direct action tactics, have histories. They've developed over time through a bunch of different movement experiences. So I try to offer a little bit of a historical perspective at the beginning, and then I talk a bit about what are these politics in terms of both the oppositional aspect and the more sort of positive affirmative aspect. And the oppositional aspect is me talking about, so what are the things that we're against, and how do we think about these systems that we oppose and the politics that we develop around opposing these systems. And then I talk a bit about the affirmative, which I understand very much as related to prefigurative politics, which is trying to bring our values and reflect our values and our visions to the greatest extent possible through how we organize right now. And I talk about some of the concrete ways that we go about doing that. The second part of the book is about strategy, which came up very consistently in interviews and conversations I had with many people. And strategy, to be very specific, is plan, like making plans to get us from this world as it is right now to the world that we would like to achieve on a large scale. So I take a couple of chapters to really get into why is it so challenging to develop these kinds of plans, even in short-term ways, in the organizing work we're doing right now. And what are some of the ways that people are developing strategy right now within radical movements that seem more promising? And I point to a few different examples there, and particularly drawing on the experiences of radical migrant justice organizing and prison industrial complex abolitionist efforts. And the last part of the book is on organizing. And there I'm trying to dig into what do we actually mean by organizing? Is it something that's different than activism? And I'm particularly interested in this question of organizing as a process of trying to bring people together and build power over the long term. And how do we do that? How do we build those kinds of relationships in effective ways? And part of that section is also a chapter on leadership and the question of leadership, and why is leadership such a consistently difficult topic for people with more kind of anti-authoritarian politics to discuss, and how can we think about other kinds of leadership besides these kind of very top-down, individualistic or charismatic forms of leadership. And the last part is on organization, which I think is another issue that is often very challenging for people who are skeptical of large, bureaucratic, top-down organizations. How do we think about formalizing what we're doing and building organizations and institutions that meet our values and can actually also be resilient in sustaining our movements and struggles over long-haul periods of time? So that's a kind of overview of the book.
And so just to follow up on the organization thing, I think there's a really good way of describing it, which is one of the interviewees you had described it as using a vehicle.
Yeah.
So do you want to just explain that metaphor?
Yeah, so this was a conversation I had with an organizer based in Atlanta, Georgia, Steph Gilyud, who works with a group called Project South that does movement building support work actually throughout the southern United States. And in talking with Steph, she at one point talked about organizations as vehicles for movement building. And she said, we need to think about a whole variety of vehicles that we might need to take us in various directions along the road to building the movements that we want to have to radically transform the world. And she said, we might need little zippy cars sometimes, we might need really big trucks at other times that are capable of really pulling a lot of weight. But what she was getting at, in my interpretation, is that we shouldn't just be focused on trying to find this one perfect model of organization and then just replicate it everywhere. But instead we should be thinking about the variety of models that we need and how we can be experimenting and building those kinds of models while also figuring out ways that they can be connected with one another. And I really appreciated this kind of spirit of experimentation there, and also thinking about organization as always being connected to movement building. Because I'm very interested in organizations that can further movements rather than fracturing movements. Often organizations actually put their own needs and interests ahead of building the kind of large-scale struggle that I think we need, and I think we should actually reverse those priorities and have it be, how can organization further the large-scale struggle?
Yeah, and I think that when you talk about like a movement building approach seems to be one of the centering or focal things of this whole book.
Yeah, that's right. It's really, and this again is something that came up very consistently among people that I spoke to, was this idea of movement building. And so I wanted to try and dig into it a little bit. What do we mean by movement building, right? And part of what I started to see as I thought about it and talked about it further with more and more people, including people who I didn't interview, just people I ended up having conversations with in many places, is that we are developing a kind of movement building approach, which is about how do we grow things, how do we build things, so that there are more and more opportunities for larger groups of people to become engaged and involved in our movements, right? So that we're not just isolating ourselves in small kind of sequestered subcultural activist scenes, but instead are actually figuring out ways to bring more people in and be connected with the everyday struggles of people who may never consider themselves to be activists, even though they may be involved in struggles that have the potential to actually change the world in important ways.
Yeah, and there's I think there's two phrases that you use to describe this politics, and so one is the against and beyond, which is what you were talking about in the politics of what we're against and what also we're for, or prefigurative kind of thing. Yeah. But the other one that I was going to go to was being of the world, in the world, but not of it.
Yeah, that's
I think
right.
so. And it made me think when you were talking about this movement of building approach and working with people where they're at. And I think also the key thing about you're actually trying to create change, like you're not a pure politics, but more of a effective politics, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, one of part of what I try to do in this book was point to a series of tensions that we maybe aren't going to be able to fully resolve in our work to try and change the world. And I think one of these tensions is the tension between sort of holding on to a pristine vision of a beautiful place that we would like to reach, and on the other end of this tension, being really sort of stuck in the practical realities of this very difficult world that we live in. And part of the way that I came to approach this tension was based on a conversation I had with a longtime radical activist and organizer and a former political prisoner in the United States named Antiauthoritarian, who came out of the Black Panther Party and the Black Liberation Army, and now considers himself like an anarchist panther, is I think how he would describe himself. And one of the interesting conversations I had with Ashanti was where he specifically talked about this tension in relation to vision and strategy, and he brought up this idea of in the world but not of it, that we should be in this world as it currently exists, which is a world not as we would like it to be, but we don't have to be stuck in this world at the same time. We can try and organize and struggle and bring people together in ways that point toward the vision of a different world that we would like to create together. And I do think that that means actually being attentive to what's going on in this world and how people are struggling and suffering in this world, and the immiseration, violence, and destruction that's happening here all of the time, while holding on to a vision of something that could be different and figuring out what can we do that actually will help us move there, and not just settling for trying to tinker in this world as it is, but also not trying to opt out or somehow escape from this world as it is, because there is no escape except through social transformation.